So my wife and I are expecting our first child. It's exciting, obviously, but also terrifying. We've been together for a while, and the pregnancy is a dream come true for us. Or at least it was until my mother-in-law decided to get involved in the naming process. And not in a helpful, oh, here's a nice family name you might like kind of way. No, her suggestion was, well, let me back up. My mother-in-law had a cat, a very pampered, spoiled, and overindulged cat named Whiskers. Whiskers was not your average house cat. This cat had her own little bed in the living room, a wardrobe. Yes, an actual wardrobe of cat outfits for various holidays, and even a designated Whiskers Day. Once a year where my mother-in-law would bake a cake and invite the neighbors over to celebrate the cat's birthday. You could say that Whiskers wasn't just a pet to her. Whiskers was basically family. When Whiskers passed away a few months before we announced the pregnancy, it hit her hard. She held a full-blown funeral for the cat, complete with a tiny casket, and insisted everyone attend. We all went because, well, she was grieving, and you don't say no to someone in mourning, right? Anyway, fast forward to us sharing the happy news that we were expecting. My wife and I hadn't really started thinking about names yet. We were more focused on getting through the first trimester and all the weird pregnancy symptoms, so when her mother suggested naming our unborn child after Whiskers, I thought it was a joke. A bad one, but still a joke. You can imagine my surprise when I realized she was completely serious. She brought it up casually one afternoon over coffee at her house, in that sweet but kind of manipulative tone she uses when she's about to push one of her bizarre ideas. You know, I've been thinking, she said, with that thoughtful expression she gets when she's about to say something outrageous. It would be such a lovely tribute to Whiskers if you named the baby after her. She was such a significant part of the family, after all. At first, I just sort of stared, waiting for the punchline. There had to be a punchline, right? But no, my mother-in-law was dead serious. She even went into this whole spiel about how Whiskers had brought so much love and joy into her life, and how naming the baby after the cat would bring a sense of continuity and closure. By this point, I was desperately searching my wife's face for signs of a shared disbelief. But here's the kicker. My wife didn't immediately shut the idea down. In fact, she looked thoughtful, like she was actually considering it. Now, to be fair, my wife is a very empathetic person. She's always been close to her mom, and the death of Whiskers had clearly been hard on her, too. So I could sort of see how she might want to entertain her mom's idea, just to be nice. But still, naming our firstborn child after a cat, a deceased cat? I let the conversation hang in the air, hoping it would just pass and we'd move on to normal pregnancy topics like nursery colors or baby clothes. But my mother-in-law wasn't done. She kept bringing it up in the following days, each time with a more elaborate reason why it was such a good idea. One time, she even pulled out an old photo album of Whiskers in various stages of life, from kitten to elderly cat, flipping through it with misty eyes while waxing poetic about how Whiskers always had a special connection with people, as if that somehow justified naming a human child after her. Meanwhile, I kept waiting for my wife to put a stop to this madness, but instead she would nod along sympathetically, occasionally making comments like, "I know, Mom, Whiskers was such a good cat," or "We'll think about it, okay? We'll think about it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Every time my mother-in-law left the room, I would glance at my wife, expecting her to say, "Don't worry, I'll talk to her." That's obviously not happening. But no, she never said that. Then, one evening, my wife and I were having a quiet moment at home, and I decided to finally ask her directly what was going on. "Are you seriously considering naming our child after Whiskers?" I asked, trying to keep my tone as neutral as possible. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Look, I know it sounds ridiculous," she admitted, "but my mom is really grieving. You know how much Whiskers meant to her. She's been a mess since the cat died, and this is the first time I've seen her excited about something in months. I just don't want to hurt her feelings right now." Okay, fair. I get that my mother-in-law is hurting. Losing a pet can be rough, especially one that was clearly treated better than some humans. But still, there had to be a line, right? I mean, where does it end? Do we start celebrating the kids' birthdays by letting them chase a laser pointer? Do we get them a litter box instead of a crib? My wife seemed torn. On one hand, she wasn't totally sold on the idea, but on the other hand, she wasn't exactly against it either. It was one of those situations where she was stuck between wanting to support her mother and wanting to keep our child's name, not ridiculous. And my mother-in-law wasn't backing down. Every time we saw her, she would find a way to slip the name Whiskers into the conversation. "Oh, I can just imagine little Whiskers running around the house," she'd say with a dreamy smile. Or, "Wouldn't it be so sweet to have a little Whiskers in the family again?" At one point, she even made a comment about how Whiskers would be watching over the baby from cat heaven, as if the cat's spirit was somehow tied to our unborn child's destiny. As the days went by, it became clear that this wasn't just a passing suggestion. My mother-in-law was fully committed to the idea, and my wife, while not completely on board, wasn't putting up much of a fight either. I felt like I was in some sort of bizarre Twilight Zone episode where everyone around me was slowly losing their grip on reality, and I was the only one left wondering if we'd all lost our minds. The conversation wasn't resolved. Not really. It just sort of lingered there, hanging over us like a cloud. Every time I thought about bringing it up again, I hesitated, not wanting to cause more tension. But the longer we left it unspoken, the more real it started to feel. And that's where we are now, me, my pregnant wife, and the looming possibility that our child might end up named after a dead cat. So after the whole Whiskers name suggestion didn't get immediately shot down like I thought it would, things started to get weirder. My mother-in-law, apparently emboldened by the fact that my wife didn't outright reject the idea, began to ramp up her efforts. It wasn't long before every conversation, every text, and every interaction somehow circled back to Whiskers. One day, a package arrived at our door. It was addressed to both my wife and me, which was a bit unusual since most of the stuff coming in recently was either baby-related or something my wife had ordered. But this wasn't an online shopping delivery. When we opened it, there, staring back at us, was a baby blanket. It was light blue, super soft, and embroidered across the middle in bold, curly letters was Whiskers. I honestly thought I was seeing things. I held it up to show my wife, expecting her to be as shocked as I was. She looked at it for a second, and instead of laughing it off like a normal person might, she just sighed, like this was somehow predictable. "It's just a gift," she said, more to herself than to me. "You know how she is." Yeah, I did know how she was, and that's exactly what worried me. The name Whiskers was starting to creep into our lives, slowly but surely, like a bad song you can't get out of your head. This wasn't just a quirky suggestion anymore. This was turning into an all-out campaign. A few days after the blanket incident, my mother-in-law started dropping by more often. You'd think this would be normal, right? I mean, grandparents to get excited. But this wasn't just excitement. Every visit involved a new angle, a new tactic. It was like she'd been strategizing. She started framing the whole Whiskers name as some kind of emotional healing process for herself. She would sit down with my wife, telling her that naming the baby after the cat would somehow bring closure to the grief she had been carrying since Whiskers' death. According to her, it wasn't just about honoring the cat, it was about carrying on the legacy of love that Whiskers had brought into her life. I honestly didn't know how to respond to that. A legacy of love? From a cat? My wife, though, was starting to look a little more sympathetic toward her mother's feelings. I could see it in her eyes when they'd talk, the way her shoulders would drop just a bit, like she was feeling the weight of her mother's grief. And while I get that losing a pet can be hard, this was spiraling into something way beyond normal. As if the blanket wasn't enough, we soon found ourselves hosting a family dinner, which my mother-in-law had organized, naturally. We hadn't been planning on a big gathering, but she somehow convinced my wife it would be a good opportunity to bring everyone together for a celebration of family. Of course, I knew what this really was, a thinly veiled attempt to push the name agenda. Sure enough, halfway through the dinner, after we'd all eaten and were sitting around chatting, my mother-in-law brought it up again. She leaned forward in her chair, all eyes on her, and casually mentioned how wonderful it would be for the baby to be named Whiskers. And then, without missing a beat, she started talking about it as if it was already a done deal. She was dropping phrases like, "When little Whiskers arrives, and I can't wait to meet Whiskers." I scanned the room, hoping someone would say something, anything that would shut this down. But instead, the room was filled with an awkward silence. You know that silence when everyone knows something is off, but no one wants to be the first to say it? That's what we had. Some of the extended family members looked confused. A few of them exchanged nervous glances, and one of my wife's cousins even let out a weird half-laugh, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. But no one said a word. And my wife? She just sat there, biting her lip, like she didn't want to make a scene. I kept expecting her to jump in and clarify, to explain that we hadn't actually decided anything yet, but she didn't. Later that night, after everyone left, I finally brought it up with her again. "We're not seriously considering this, right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. I didn't want to start a fight, but I was getting seriously worried that this was becoming a real possibility. My wife hesitated for a moment. "Look, we need to talk about this," she finally said. "Mom's really struggling, and I just don't know how to tell her no without making things worse." That was it. The moment I realized my wife was actually wavering, she wasn't outright agreeing to the name, but she wasn't dismissing it either. And suddenly I found myself in this uncomfortable place where it wasn't just my mother-in-law I had to worry about, it was the fact that my wife was actually considering her mother's feelings over something as important as naming our child. I tried to reason with her. I explained that while I understood her mother was going through a rough time, naming our baby after a cat was not the way to help her cope. But my wife kept circling back to the same point, her mother's grief, her mother's needs. And the more we talked, the more I could feel the tension growing between us. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law didn't stop with just one baby blanket. A few days after the dinner, another package showed up. This time it was a tiny onesie, also embroidered with the name Whiskers, along with a small note that read, "For my little Whiskers." I showed it to my wife, expecting her to finally see how ridiculous this was getting, but she just sighed again and tucked it away in the nursery. The conversation kept hanging over us, unresolved. My wife dropped a hint that we'd need to have a serious talk about the name before the baby was born. I felt trapped. How did I get here, in this situation where naming our child after a cat wasn't immediately laughed off and thrown in the trash? I knew this wasn't going to end easily, and the more my mother-in-law pushed, the more I feared my wife would eventually cave. I could already see it in the way she avoided confrontation, the way she tried to balance keeping her mother happy and maintaining our sanity. And now we were heading toward a conversation I wasn't sure I was ready for, one where I'd have to draw a line. But how do you even start that conversation when your wife thinks naming your baby Whiskers might actually be a real option? So, the Whiskers situation continued to snowball in a way I never imagined. After the onesie and baby blanket incidents, things started getting even more tense at home. My wife, instead of stepping back and realizing how ridiculous this was getting, seemed to be leaning into it. Slowly but surely, my mother-in-law's emotional manipulation was working its magic. I started noticing my wife casually referring to baby items as Whiskers things at first. It was a one-off joke, like when we were browsing online for a crib. She'd say things like, "Do you think this one would look nice for Whiskers?" She would laugh as if she were joking, but I couldn't help but notice that she was getting too comfortable with the idea. I'd laugh along nervously, hoping it was just her way of dealing with the absurdity of the situation. But then, she started doing it more often. Strollers, baby clothes, even pacifiers, it all became Whiskers' new stuff. That's when I realized she might be more serious about the name than I'd initially thought. It was like this slow, creeping acceptance of something that should have been a complete non-starter. Every time I brought it up, it was brushed off, and the tension between us started to grow. And my mother-in-law, oh, she wasn't backing down. She started contacting me directly, which was new. She'd never been one to reach out to me unless it was for a birthday or some family event. So when I got a text from her, I was already on edge. The text was just a friendly reminder, of course, about how important it would be to her if we considered naming the baby after Whiskers. It was like she was trying to make me understand, as if I just wasn't getting the emotional significance behind her request. I didn't respond to the text, thinking that would be the end of it. But then she called. She didn't call to chat about baby preparations or how my wife was doing. No, she called to specifically talk about the name. It wasn't even subtle. She launched into this speech about how Whiskers had been her emotional support through tough times, how she believed the name would bring positive energy into our lives, and how, as a family, it would show unity. I listened, not wanting to be rude, but I couldn't help but feel trapped. How do you argue with that without sounding like a jerk? I mean, I get it, losing a pet can be tough. And yes, pets are part of the family in a way, but this was taking things too far. She finished her spiel by saying, "I just know you'll do the right thing." The right thing? According to whom? When I tried bringing this up with my wife later that night, things took a turn I wasn't prepared for. We were in the nursery, going through the latest batch of baby clothes from a shopping trip, and I casually mentioned that her mom had called me to talk about the name. That's when she snapped. She accused me of not being supportive of her family, of not understanding how hard her mother's grief had been. She said her mom had always been there for us, and this one small request wasn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. I was stunned. I hadn't expected this level of defensiveness. We weren't talking about a middle name suggestion or a family tradition here. We were talking about naming our child after a cat. I pointed out how ridiculous it was, naming a human child after a pet, but that only made things worse. My wife accused me of being cold and unfeeling. She told me that I was dismissing her mother's feelings as if they didn't matter. It was the first real fight we'd had since the pregnancy began, and it was over a cat's name. I couldn't believe this was happening. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law wasn't just working on my wife. She had started spreading rumors within the family, making me look like the unreasonable one. I started getting strange looks from her side of the family at gatherings. I could overhear the whispers, how I wasn't being supportive, how I was shutting down my mother-in-law's harmless suggestion. Suddenly, I was the bad guy, the one standing in the way of family unity. It was maddening. The pressure was building, and it came to a head at yet another family gathering. My mother-in-law had organized a casual get-together, but I knew there was an ulterior motive. By now, I could see it coming a mile away. Sure enough, about halfway through dinner, she stood up to give a little speech, as she so often liked to do. Only this time, the speech wasn't just about how excited she was to be a grandmother. No, this speech was about Whiskers. She went on and on about how Whiskers had been a part of the family for years, how the cat had helped her through hard times, and how special it would be to carry on Whiskers' name through the next generation. It was a well-crafted manipulation. I could see her carefully choosing her words to make it seem like we'd already agreed to this. The room fell silent. I looked at my wife, waiting for her to step in, to say something, to clarify that nothing had been decided. But she just sat there, quietly listening, her face expressionless. I could feel my heart sinking. My mother-in-law was cornering me in front of everyone, and my wife wasn't coming to my defense. After the speech, some family members came up to me, offering vague comments about how nice it would be to keep Whiskers' memory alive. They weren't overtly pressuring me, but the implication was there. I was being painted into a corner, and I could feel the walls closing in. By the time we got home, I was at my breaking point. This wasn't just a quirky idea anymore. It was a full-blown campaign, and my wife was seriously considering it. We were on the verge of a serious confrontation, and I knew we couldn't avoid it any longer. Something had to give, and I was starting to realize that this might be the defining moment for us. Would she back me, or would she side with her mother? At this point, I thought things couldn't possibly get any weirder. But if there's one thing I've learned through this whole saga, it's that my mother-in-law is full of surprises, none of them good. It started when she began referring to the unborn baby exclusively as Whiskers, and I'm not talking about the occasional slip-up. No, she was fully committed to this. Every time we saw her, she'd say things like, "Oh, I can't wait until Whiskers is here." Or, "I've been knitting Whiskers some booty." She didn't even bother using the baby or your little one anymore. It was all Whiskers all the time. I tried to set some boundaries. I figured maybe she just needed a gentle reminder that we hadn't agreed on a name yet. So I brought it up during one of our visits, just casually mentioning that we were still thinking about names. That was my way of politely saying, please stop calling our baby Whiskers, but she completely ignored it, pretending like I hadn't even spoken. Instead, she doubled down. The next day, I got an email from her with a list of baby name suggestions, except every single one of them had Whiskers in the middle or as the first name. There was Whiskers James, Whiskers Anne, and my personal favorite, Whiskers Marie Catherine, because of course nothing says sophistication like naming your child after a cat. It was like she was trying to cover all her bases, offering up compromises that still kept the cat's name front and center. I was baffled. Who does this? I showed the email to my wife, hoping that finally she'd see how absurd this whole thing had become. But instead of agreeing with me, she just shrugged. "She's grieving," my wife said, like that was supposed to explain everything. Sure, I get it. I understand grief. But this was not normal. This was turning into some kind of bizarre obsession, and I was starting to feel like I was the only one who saw it. I tried reaching out to other family members for support, thinking maybe someone else would have the guts to step in and talk some sense into her. But every time I brought it up, I was met with uncomfortable silences or awkward jokes. Some of them even said things like, "Well, it's just a name, or you'll figure it out." No one wanted to get involved. They all saw it as some family drama that they were better off avoiding. I was on my own. Meanwhile, my wife was becoming more and more defensive of her mom. Every time I tried to talk to her about it, she'd shut down the conversation or accuse me of not being sensitive to her mother's feelings. We were at a low point. I was starting to feel like I was in this battle alone, trying to keep our child from being named after a cat, while everyone else around me acted like I was the crazy one. The breaking point came when my mother-in-law decided to throw a surprise baby shower. I didn't even know it was happening until the morning of. My wife had been in on it but thought it would be fun to surprise me. That was red flag number one. When we arrived at her house, I immediately noticed something was off. There were decorations, lots of decorations, banners, balloons, streamers, except all of them had the word Whiskers on them. There was a huge banner hanging over the front door that read, "Welcome, baby Whiskers." The cake was shaped like a cat, with the name Whiskers written in icing. And the centerpiece? A framed picture of the actual cat, Whiskers, right in the middle of the table. It was like I had walked into some alternate reality where naming a child after a deceased pet was not only accepted but celebrated. I felt my stomach drop. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading. The moment where it became clear that my mother-in-law had no intention of letting this go, and my wife wasn't stopping her. Everyone at the shower was acting like this was normal. People were walking around, eating cake, commenting on how cute the decorations were, and no one seemed to be bothered by the fact that the entire theme of the shower was centered around a dead cat's name. I stood there, trying to process how we'd gotten to this point. How had something that should have been a joke, a ridiculous suggestion, turned into a reality that I was now living in? My wife was mingling with guests, laughing and smiling like everything was fine. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled her aside away from everyone and asked her point blank what was going on. How could she let this happen? How could she let her mom take over our child's name like this? And that's when she dropped the bombshell. She told me that she had been thinking about it, really thinking about it, and maybe, just maybe, her mom was right. Maybe naming the baby Whiskers wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. She even said it might bring some peace to her mom, that it could help heal the wounds of losing the cat. I felt like the ground had just dropped out from under me. This wasn't just my mother-in-law's insanity anymore. My wife was seriously considering it. Naming our child after a cat was now on the table as a real option. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I looked around the room at the ridiculous decorations, at the picture of Whiskers staring at me from the table, and I felt completely isolated. This wasn't just some quirky suggestion anymore. This was my life. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was at a crossroads. Could I really stay in a relationship where this was being taken seriously? Could I raise a child who might grow up being called Whiskers because my mother-in-law had an emotional attachment to a dead cat? That's where I am now, standing at this surreal breaking point, wondering what comes next. After the absurd baby shower with the Whiskers-themed decorations, I was mentally exhausted. It felt like I was living in a nightmare where everyone around me had lost their minds. I could no longer sit quietly and let this happen. My wife wasn't just going along with her mom's idea anymore. She was seriously considering naming our child after a dead cat. I realized I was at a breaking point, and if something didn't change soon, I didn't know if I could stay in this situation. But then, something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, my wife's cousin, Sarah, reached out to me. Sarah and I had never been particularly close, but we got along well enough at family gatherings. She's one of those people who manages to stay out of the family drama, so I didn't expect her to get involved in this whole mess. But apparently she had heard about the Whiskers situation through the grapevine and felt compelled to talk to me. We met up for coffee a few days later, and to my surprise, Sarah was fully on my side. She told me she couldn't believe what was happening either, and that she had her own issues with my mother-in-law's manipulative behavior. Apparently, this wasn't the first time my mother-in-law had tried to pull something like this, though admittedly, naming a baby after a cat was a new level of crazy. Sarah mentioned how my mother-in-law had manipulated other family members into doing things they didn't want, all under the guise of family unity or emotional guilt. It was a relief to hear that I wasn't the only one who thought this was all insane. Sarah was ready to help me put an end to it. We talked for a long time about how to approach the situation, and she suggested we stage an intervention of sorts. The idea was to involve a few other key family members, people who my mother-in-law respected, and who could help us get through to her without it turning into a huge fight. Sarah took charge of reaching out to a couple of family members who she thought would be sympathetic to our side. One of them was my wife's aunt, a no-nonsense woman who had never been afraid to speak her mind. Another was Sarah's brother, who had dealt with his own share of guilt trips from my mother-in-law in the past. With their support, I started to feel like maybe we had a chance of stopping this train before it completely derailed. The plan was to confront my mother-in-law at the next family dinner, which was coming up that weekend. It was risky. I knew there was a chance it could blow up in my face, but I was out of options. If I didn't do something, I feared my wife would continue to be pulled deeper into her mom's web, and we'd end up with a child named Whiskers. That Saturday, we all gathered at my mother-in-law's house. It felt like any other family dinner, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. I could tell Sarah and the others were just as anxious as I was. My wife seemed oblivious, chatting with her mom and the rest of the family like nothing was wrong. But I knew what was coming, and I had no idea how she was going to react. About halfway through the dinner, when the conversation lulled, Sarah cleared her throat and gave me a nod. This was it. So she began, her voice calm but firm. I think we need to talk about something important. It's about the baby's name. Everyone stopped talking. My mother-in-law looked up, a knowing smile creeping across her face, as if she expected us to confirm that Whiskers was a done deal. But then Sarah continued, "We all know that naming a baby is a big decision, and it's something that should reflect both parents' wishes. I know you've been really attached to the idea of naming the baby after Whiskers, but I think it's time we have an honest conversation about whether that's the right decision." My mother-in-law's smile faltered, and she looked around the table, realizing that the conversation wasn't going the way she had hoped. She glanced at my wife, as if expecting her to jump in and defend the name, but Sarah didn't give her a chance. "I understand that Whiskers meant a lot to you," Sarah said, "but this isn't about a cat. This is about a child, a person who's going to live with their name for the rest of their life. I think it's important that we all recognize that." There was a pause, and for a moment I thought my mother-in-law was going to explode. Her face went red and she looked like she was struggling to hold back a flood of emotions. But then, she did exactly what I feared. She played the guilt card. "I just thought it would be a nice way to honor Whiskers," she said, her voice wavering. "She was there for me through so much, and I thought it would be a way to keep her memory alive. I never meant to upset anyone." That's when Sarah's brother chimed in. "Aunt Mother-in-law's name, we all love you, but this has gotten out of hand. It's okay to grieve, but you can't push your grief onto my wife and me. They need to make this decision for themselves, without pressure." I could see the gears turning in my wife's head. She looked torn, like she was finally starting to realize how deep her mother's influence had gotten. My mother-in-law tried to push back, but every time she did, someone from our side would gently, but firmly, remind her that this wasn't just about her. It was about the baby, about us as parents, and about making decisions that were in the best interest of our child. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. My wife remained quiet through most of it, but by the end of the conversation, she turned to me and said, "Maybe we do need to step back and think about this." It wasn't a full victory, but it was enough for now. My mother-in-law reluctantly agreed to let us decide the name without further interference, though I could tell she wasn't thrilled about it. The tension hung in the air as we left the dinner, but there was a sense of relief too. My wife finally seemed to see the absurdity of the situation, and I could tell she was starting to come around. This wasn't the end, but it felt like the beginning of a resolution. Finally, the grip my mother-in-law had on the naming process was loosening, and we were getting closer to making this decision together as a couple. After the dinner confrontation, things started to settle down, though it didn't happen overnight. My mother-in-law wasn't exactly thrilled with how everything had gone down. She was clearly upset that her grandchild wasn't going to be named after Whiskers, but to my relief, she backed off. Begrudgingly, yes, but she did. For a few weeks, there was an awkward tension every time we saw her. She didn't bring up the baby's name anymore, but you could tell she wasn't happy about it. My wife and I had a few quiet discussions afterward, where we agreed that the name would be our decision alone. It was a turning point for us, honestly. I could see that my wife was starting to understand just how out of control things had gotten with her mom. It wasn't that my wife had been blind to it, she was just too close to the situation to see how much of her mother's grief and pressure had influenced her. But now, she was stepping back and seeing things clearly. We worked together to start setting boundaries with my mother-in-law. It was a bit tricky at first. She would make subtle comments here and there about how certain names would have been a beautiful tribute, but we ignored them. Eventually, she realized we weren't going to budge. The thing is, my mother-in-law loves to be in control, but she also hates confrontation. Once she saw that we were united on this, she gradually accepted it, albeit with a lingering sense of disappointment. As the baby's due date approached, my wife and I finally chose a name we both loved. It had nothing to do with Whiskers, of course. We went with something simple, classic, and meaningful to us. When we told my mother-in-law, she smiled politely. though I'm sure it wasn't the name she had envisioned. But to her credit, she didn't push back. She just nodded and said, "Well, it's a lovely name." The final weeks of the pregnancy were a blur of excitement and preparation. My wife and I focused on getting the nursery ready, making sure we had everything we needed for the baby's arrival. My mother-in-law stayed involved, but in a more subdued way. She still came by to help with last-minute tasks, but the tension over the name was gone. It was almost like she had resigned herself to the fact that she wasn't getting her way. And honestly, that was a relief. Then, the big day finally arrived. After what felt like the longest 9 months of our lives, our baby was born, a healthy, beautiful little girl. The moment she was placed in my arms, everything else melted away. All the stress, the ridiculous drama over the name, it all just disappeared in that instant. She was perfect, and the name we had chosen suited her perfectly. It felt right, like this was exactly how things were meant to be. When my mother-in-law came to the hospital to meet her granddaughter, I braced myself for some awkward comment or a last-minute plea to reconsider the name. But to my surprise, there was none of that. She held the baby, smiled, and simply said, "She's beautiful," and for the first time in months, I actually believed she was genuinely happy, not just putting on a show. It seemed like she had finally let go of the whiskers thing and was ready to embrace her role as a grandmother without the baggage of her grief over the cat. In the weeks that followed, we all started to find our rhythm. My wife and I were adjusting to life as new parents, and our relationship felt stronger than it had in a long time. We'd been through a ridiculous amount of stress, but in the end, we had come out of it together. We talked more openly about setting boundaries with her mom, and while there was still some work to do, we were on the same page. As for my mother-in-law, well, she was still her usual self, just slightly less overbearing. She visited often, bringing meals and baby clothes, and even though I noticed she still had a framed picture of Whiskers on her mantle, she never once mentioned the name again. It was like the whole saga had been erased from her memory. I suppose she had finally come to terms with the fact that her beloved cat's name wasn't going to live on through our child. Instead, she channeled all her energy into being the doting grandmother, and honestly, that was fine with me. Looking back, the whole ordeal seems almost absurd. I still can't quite believe we spent months battling over whether or not to name our child after a deceased pet. It feels like something out of a sitcom, the kind of ridiculous family drama you hear about and think, that can't possibly be real. But it was real, every weird, frustrating moment of it. In the end, though, we made it through. My wife and I are stronger for it, and we learned some valuable lessons along the way. We learned the importance of standing our ground, of setting boundaries with family, and of making decisions that are right for us, no matter how much outside pressure we're facing. And I think my mother-in-law, in her own way, learned a lesson too. Maybe not about boundaries. I'm not holding my breath on that one, but about the fact that not everything can go her way, and that's okay. So here we are now, a few months into parenthood, with a beautiful baby girl who has a name that has nothing to do with a cat. And while I know my mother-in-law will always have a soft spot for Whiskers, she's finally accepted that her granddaughter isn't going to carry that legacy. She still keeps a little shrine to Whiskers in her living room, complete with the cat's old collar and a framed paw print, but at least it's not hanging over our heads anymore. In the end, we survived the Whiskers war, and now we get to focus on what really matters: raising our daughter and enjoying life as a family, without any more ridiculous naming drama.